All right, we carry on. 1 Corinthians, Paul had prohibited the Corinthian Christians from attending the idol feast and the pagan temples. And as I've said, some were pushing back against that prohibition. They claimed, among other things, that the fact that they knew there was only one God, that meant that their attending the temple feast, it wasn't an act of idolatry. And Paul in chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, he says, in essence, let me paraphrase how I understand it. He says, look, let's assume for the sake of argument that what you're claiming makes it permissible for you to attend the idol feast. You must still consider the limitation that brotherly love places on the exercise of your liberty. When that's taken into account, it would be wrong for you to exercise your alleged liberty, because some brothers and sisters who will see you eating in the idol temples could not participate in those meals without violating their consciences. In doing so, they would feel like they were worshiping a rival God and were thus being disloyal to the one true God. By pushing them to violate their idol-sensitive consciences, you would be pushing them towards spiritual destruction by beginning the searing of their consciences. So that's the essence of what I think Paul says there. And that's why he sums up in verse 13 with, therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat forevermore, so that I not cause my brother to stumble. See, his love for his brothers and sisters, for their spiritual welfare, he put that above the exercise of his liberty. That if it meant harming them, then he wouldn't exercise his liberty. Now, in chapter 9, verses 1 to 23, Paul responds to those who are resisting his prohibition against attending the idol feast, who are pushing back against that prohibition. But here he responds to those who are pushing back by questioning his apostolic authority, by saying, well, is Paul really somebody in a position to say this to us? And so let's read in 9, 1 to 14. Paul says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, yet at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who are judging me is this: can it be that we do not have authority to eat and drink? Can it be that we also do not have authority to take along a wife who is a sister, as also the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Cephas? Or do only I and Barnabas not have authority not to work? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Or who shepherds a flock and does not drink of the flock's milk? Do I say these things as a man, or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Is the matter of oxen a concern to God, or does it not undoubtedly speak for us? Indeed, it was written for us, because the one who plows ought to plow in hope, and the one who threshes to thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we sowed spiritual things among you, is it a great matter if we shall reap your material things? If others share in authority over you, do we not all the more? But we did not use this authority. Instead, we put up with all things so that we not give any kind of hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who conduct the sacred rites at the things of the temple, that those who serve at the altar share in what's offered on the altar? So also the Lord ordained those who proclaim the gospel to live from the gospel. Now, Paul, he criticizes the Corinthians for challenging his prohibition of attending the idol feast by calling into question his apostolic authority. And it seems that the challenge they're mounting to his authority was being framed in terms of the fact that Paul refused to accept material support from the Corinthians, from the locals. He refused to do that, and it's also framed in the fact that he seemed to go both ways on the issue of eating marketplace food. In other words, food that had been sacrificed to idols that was later sold in the marketplaces and eaten in homes. So they say, listen, Paul here, you seem to be, the fact you refuse to take our support is a strike against your authenticity. And the fact that when it comes to this marketplace, you seem to be inconsistent. You seem to go both ways. And Paul begins his reaction to that with a flood of rhetorical questions. The answer to each of them is of course. Where he says, am I not free? Well, of course he's free. And he asks first, am I not free? Which relates to their attempt to deny him the freedom to forego their support by saying that you don't have the freedom to do that. By doing that, that's somehow a strike against your apostolic authority. So they're denying him the freedom to forego their support, and they're denying him the freedom to eat or reject food, which comes into play when they start talking about his alleged inconsistency in how he deals with marketplace food. But those things, see, he picks this stuff up in 15 to 23. This am I not free with regard to accepting material support, how he handles the marketplace food. He's going to deal with that and address that in 15 to 23. The second question, he says, am I not an apostle? Well, that's the focus of verses 1 to 14. Is Paul an apostle? And proof of his apostleship is in the following rhetorical questions that he asks. Am I not an apostle? He reminds them that he had seen Jesus. Right? Referring to his Damascus Road experience, he says, have I not seen Jesus our Lord? What are you talking about? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? He reminds him, and he reminds him that they are the result of his labor in the Lord. The Corinthian church was planted by Paul. Their very existence as a church serves to authenticate, or it serves as a seal of his apostleship, because church planting, that's what apostles do. So the very fact you exist authenticates my role as an apostle. Why do you think you're there? Who came and brought the gospel to you? I did. And then in verses 3 through 14, Paul, he plays variations on the single theme that he had a right to their support, that he was entitled to their support. You see, it seems that his failure to accept support from the Corinthians, that was being used against him, like I say, as a challenge. Somehow they look at this and say, the fact he won't take support from us implies he's not entitled to. And he's not entitled to because he's not the real deal. Okay, that seems to be the kind of what they're saying. As Gordon Fee says in his commentary, philosophers and wandering missionaries in the Greco-Roman world made their living in one of four ways: fees, patronage, begging, and working. Each of these had both proponents and detractors who viewed rival forms as unworthy of philosophy. So you had the very fact that Paul has chosen to support himself and to work manually already comes with people who are going to say that's not an appropriate or proper way for somebody in your role to earn, to be supported. But beyond that, they're saying, look, the fact you won't accept this from us is a strike against your authenticity, because if you were the real deal, you'd accept support from us. So that, at least in pockets of the congregation, this is what was being said. And by the time of Paul's ministry in Corinth, he had chosen the way he was going to he was going to use manual labor, tent making, as his basic means of support. Now, he would take money from distant people, but not from locals. And he has a rationale that he will explain why he does that. Now, when later teachers come to Corinth, like Apollos and possibly Peter, when they came there and they accepted patronage, when they accepted material support so that they did not have to work, they were paid. They were supported. Well, that focused attention you see on Paul's refusal to do so. It highlighted, well, that's very different. Paul wouldn't accept it. And here are people who are doing it. His failure to accept patronage, it was, as I say, interpreted to mean that he had no right to it. He had no right to that support, which, given that the other apostles were entitled to it, that called his apostleship into question in the eyes of some. It was at least used by some to raise a question about his authority to say these things he's saying to us about not going to the idol feasts. So Paul first establishes that he was also entitled to their financial support. Okay, he labors to make this point. No. It's not that I'm not entitled to it. It's not that I don't have a right to it. I have a right to it. And I'm entitled to it. It's simply that I renounce that right. It's simply that I choose not to use that right. But I got a right. And so since the claim he doesn't have a right was important to the claim that he lacks the apostolic authority, he's going to hammer to show, oh no, I do in fact have a right. Verses 4 to 6, it's a series of these intense rhetorical questions designed to force them to recognize what they should already know, that Paul has all the rights of an apostle. Right? He has all the rights of an apostle. And the first two are best translated, can it be that we do not have authority or do not have the right to eat and drink, meaning to be provided what we need for sustenance, food and drink from the community, to be supported materially with the things that we need physically? Can it be that we do not have authority to take along a wife who is a sister, meaning a Christian, and also the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord, as also the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Cephas? And the expected answer is no, it can't be that they don't have such a right. And the question about the authority to take along a believing wife, that shows that the apostles' right to support, to be maintained, that it extended to their wives. So their right to material support included not only the apostles, but also the support of their wives. So not only were they entitled to that support for themselves, but they were entitled to bring with them their wives who also would be entitled to support. Now, given that others typically were accompanied by their wives, Paul is not. And given that others were accompanied by their wives, Paul's minority practice of not being accompanied by a wife was simply another way of saying he's not entitled to support. That's why he doesn't bring a wife. Either he knows that's why he didn't take a wife, because he can't support her that way, or for those who may have thought that Paul had a wife, that's why he didn't bring his wife. And so Paul says, can it be that we're not entitled to this? Of course we're entitled to this. And verse 6 shows that verse 5, you see, it's related to the issue of support, right? Because he says in 5, can it be that we don't have authority to take along a wife who's a sister, as also the rest of the apostles and the brother of the Lord in Cephas? Or do only I and Barnabas not have authority not to work? Are we the only ones who lack the right not to work and to be supported? That's just us? Okay, so you see that it's tied to this question of support. And then in verse 7, he uses a soldier, a farmer, and a shepherd to illustrate his right to support. Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? I'm out here in the battlefield. You think I don't have a right to be supported? He says, who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat of its fruit? Or who shepherds a flock and doesn't drink of the flock's milk? Of course I have a right to support. I'm entitled to your support. In verses 8 through 10, he illustrates his right to support from the Old Testament. He says, is this just coming from me? He said, no, it's not just coming from me. It comes from the Old Testament law. Right? That's what he says here. For it's written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox when he's treading out the grain. You got the ox working, he's entitled to be fed. And then he says that you think he's talking about oxen or not talking about people. He's talking about people. And so here I am working, treading out the grain. And so of course I'm entitled to be supported. And then in verse 11, in the first part of 12, he applies these points to his own situation in Corinth. Right? He says, if we sowed spiritual things among you, is it a great matter if we shall reap your material things? If others share an authority over you or right to this support, do we not all the more? Right? So he wants to nuke this idea that Paul's not entitled. He has no right because that was instrumental in making the claim that therefore he doesn't have the authority. To say he didn't have the right to support was what they were hanging this idea on, he lacks apostolic authority. So he goes in and shows that's nonsense. And then the second part of verse 12, he starts to explain why he gave up the right he had to their support. Why he didn't use that right, but then he adds two more pieces of evidence establishing his right to their support. Okay, he's going to cite general religious practice in verse 13, and then he's going to cite the teaching of Christ in verse 14. But Paul says he chose to give up his right to support so as not to hinder the gospel of Christ. He doesn't say, he doesn't explain to us, how does your accepting support from the Corinthians, how would that hinder? How would it hinder the gospel? But it seems, as we'll see from the following paragraph, in verses 15 through 18, that he thinks that his accepting support from them would hinder the gospel because it would risk misrepresenting the nature of his particular call by God, by suggesting that he had an option whether to preach, that his preaching, whether he preached, was conditioned on whether he received support. And see, that would be a misrepresentation of Paul's ministry and calling by God. So he felt that he was convinced that in his particular case, perhaps because of the unusual way he had become an apostle, right? The Damascus Road experience. Perhaps because of that unusual way, he was convinced that in his case, that misperception of his ministry, it could make him less effective. That's what he was concerned about. And the bottom line is that he gave up a right that he had, an entitlement that he had. He gave that up out of love for others in order that he might bless them. So do you see what he told them before? He says, listen, just assuming your arguments were right, brotherly love would still constrain your ability to go eat these idol feasts, because the brother with the weaker conscience who saw you and was encouraged to do that, you'd hurt them. So therefore, he's applying that very same thing to himself, that very same principle. Right? This is why I don't do it. I had a right to it, but I gave up that right out of love for other people because I thought that in my case, using that right would be a hindrance to the gospel and would therefore hurt other people, and I love those people. Okay, so you see how he ties that in, and that's what he's telling them. Then he adds these things, see, in both Jewish and pagan temples, the priests who served in making a sacrifice, they shared in the sacrificial food. So he's just giving now. He was going to explain why he didn't uses right. But then he adds these two other reasons why he had the right. Right? He sits there and says, look, both in Jewish pagan temples, those who serve in making the sacrifices, they share in the sacrificial food. So why in the world would you think that I had no right when I'm over here laboring among you? Certainly I had the right. So Paul is entitled to support from his religious labor. Then he says, he clinches the argument with a reference to the teaching of Christ. He says in verse 14, so also the Lord ordained those who proclaim the gospel to live from the gospel. That we have a right to support. Those who proclaim the gospel have a right to support. You say, where does Jesus say that? Is this something that Paul knew of? Well, it's probably what Luke says in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, when Jesus says the worker deserves his wages. Okay, the worker deserves his wages. So this was understood that Jesus had said this, and then Luke will later record this. But so he's talking about even the Lord there. Then in 9:15 to 18. But I have not used any of these things, and I do not write these things in order that it might happen this way in my case. For it is good for me rather to die than, he's going to say rather than to die than to use these things. But then he just breaks off and says, no one shall empty my boast. For if I preach the gospel, there is no boast for me, for necessity is laid on me. For woe is to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if involuntarily, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in preaching the gospel, I may present the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my authority in the gospel. Okay, Paul did not use his right to support. He had it. He was entitled to it. He's beaten that to death. He's making clear that the people who are suggesting otherwise are wrong. But I had that, but I didn't use that right, and I'm not now seeking the right. This isn't some backhanded way of getting you to support me. That's not what I'm doing at all. On the contrary, he's firmly resolved not to allow anyone to nullify his boast. To nullify his boast. He feels so strongly about this because Paul has concluded that taking support from locals will hinder his evangelistic efforts by making it look like he has a choice in whether or not to preach. As though his doing so, whether he preached, that somehow depended on whether or not he got support. And the fact is that Paul has no choice. This is what he's saying. He has no choice. God called him. You know, Paul was just bopping along. He was on his way to get Christians. God intervened dramatically, and God called him and put him under a divine obligation to preach. That's it, Paul. I'm grabbing you and I'm telling you what you're going to be doing. By giving the impression that he has a choice in whether to preach, he would misrepresent the true nature of his calling. Which misrepresentation in his case and in his circumstance would be worse for the cause of the gospel than whatever questions his refusing support might generate. He understands that by refusing support, I may generate questions. But Paul is convinced that by my taking it and therefore misrepresenting the nature of the divine obligation I am under, so you think that I preach on the condition of receiving, that would risk something far worse. So that's why I don't do it. That's why I reject these things. So that's Paul says, look, it would be fine. And Paul would rather die, right? That's what he says. It's good for me rather to die than. He would rather die than hinder the gospel by standing on his entitlement to their support. By insisting on their support when in his judgment and understanding that would ultimately be a hindrance to the cause of Christ. So Paul says, no, I'm not doing that. My read of this situation is that's it. I'm not going to do that because I think it would ultimately be harmful in how my ministry would be perceived. Now Paul boasts, you see, no one shall empty my boast. He boasts, you see, in the fact that he supported himself through manual labor. Right? I mean, that's not very like a philosopher or theologian. I mean, one of the great teachers, you're down here grunting around knitting tents together, whatever you're doing. But he boasts in that, you see, because this was a humbling of himself for the sake of the gospel. And God then uses Paul's humiliation. He uses Paul's humbling of himself in this way to save other people. You see, so he says, no one's going to deprive me of this boast. Because that's what's going on in this. God is working with Paul to save other people. And he explains that merely preaching the gospel, that doesn't provide him a reason for boasting because he has no choice in the matter. Right? It doesn't give him a reason to boast. He has no choice. He was conscripted. He was drafted by God. He didn't volunteer. He was drafted by God, and he is under divine compulsion to preach. That's what Paul says. The man who's drafted, right, who's conscripted, and who's then ordered into battle, he stands on a different footing than the person who volunteers or who enlists and then asks to go to the front line. Right? There's a difference there. Paul says, I've simply been drafted, conscripted, and sent. So I'm on a different footing than one who volunteers in the army, for example, and says, hey, I want to volunteer and I want to go to the front line. There's a distinction there. For if he preached voluntarily, he says he would have a reward. Right? If he was in that category, he would have a reward. You say, what reward would he have? He would have the special honor that accompanies voluntary service. So when somebody volunteers and says something to the front line, there's an honor in that. Paul says, I'm simply drafted. Involuntarily and told by God, you go and preach. And he says, see, so if he preached voluntarily, he'd have a reward. But since he was drafted, since he was involuntarily assigned by God the task of preaching, that reward, that particular boast, is not available to him. He simply is a slave discharging his duty. Or as he puts it here, I have been entrusted. But if involuntarily, as in his case, I've been entrusted with a stewardship. I'm simply doing what I'm obligated to do from my position. Now, does he then, as a draftee, as somebody who's been conscripted, does he have a reward in preaching? Is there anything analogous to the reward that he says exists for those who do so voluntarily, in contrast to him? Well, he says yes, he has a reward. His boast, is the freedom that he has to humble himself by preaching the gospel free of charge. You see, to voluntarily forego his rights in preaching so as not to hinder the gospel. That's the reward he has, is the liberty to forego his rights so as not to hinder the gospel. In other words, his reward in preaching is the freedom to preach without financial reward. And that's what Paul says to them. See, that in preaching the gospel, I may present the gospel without charge so as not to make full use of my authority in the gospel. That's my reward, is the very liberty that you're trying to deny me and trying to hold that against me. And then he says here in 9:19-23, For though being free of all men, I made myself a slave to all men, in order that I might gain all the more. To the Jews I became like a Jew, in order that I might gain Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though myself not being under the law, in order that I might gain those under the law. To those without the law I became like one without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, in order that I might gain those without the law. To the weak I became weak in order that I might gain the weak. I have become all things to all men in order that by all means I might save some. Now I do all things for the sake of the gospel, in order that I might be a fellow sharer in it. So having defended his apostolic authenticity by arguing for both his right, his entitlement to their material support, and his freedom to turn that material support down, Paul continues with the theme of his freedom to forego his rights for the sake of the gospel, to explain what they looked at as his wishy-washy conduct in matters of social relationships. How he acted when he was with the Jews and how he acted when he was among the Gentiles. It seems, and you can look at chapter 10, verse 23 to 33, that the problem had to do here, at least in part, with Paul's actions toward marketplace food. Okay, he's been telling them, right, you can't attend the idol feast. These feasts in the idol temples that are part of this cultic ritual. You can't do that. Well, what about stuff that's meat that has come out of there and has been sent and sold in the marketplaces? You see, and eaten in people's homes. What's the question with that? So Paul, when eating with Jews, Paul adopted their dietary scruples. In other words, he ate like a Jew. If they didn't eat the meat, Paul didn't eat the meat. If they didn't do so he adopted their scruples, and when he was eating with Gentiles, he adopted their dietary scruples. So he had no problem gobbling the meat down. Right? Because they didn't have a problem with it. Paul didn't have a problem with it. But when he was with Jews, he would. Okay, so this strikes them, see, this seeming inconsistency in his conduct. They said, look, this seems like conduct unbecoming an apostle. You seem inconsistent here, how you're doing this, especially an apostle who would deny them the right to attend cultic meals with their friends. So they say, so they're after him about this and saying, this seems that you're wishy-washy. And yet here you are putting down this law that we can't go to these idol feasts. Well, Paul says that though he was free from all men, okay, harking back to chapter 9, verse 1, he gave up that right for the sake of the gospel. He lived how others wanted him to live in order to win them to Christ. That's what he did. So he observed the Jewish dietary scruples. Why? To win them to Christ. He didn't want to raise an unnecessary hindrance to them being a receptive audience to him. So that's what Paul did. He says to the Jews, he became like a Jew. In other words, he would adopt Jewish religious practices such as their food laws, right? The kinds of things that they ate, which he as a Christian, he had long ago given up as being irrelevant to one's relationship with God. Paul understands that the Mosaic food laws are not binding on Christians. He's well aware of that. But he would go along as an accommodation for his Jewish friends so as not to needlessly alienate them, so that they would be more receptive to the gospel that he's all about. Okay, so that's what he's doing. He lives how others wanted him to live, and so he observes those food laws, and he would do so As I say, see, that was just as an accommodation. It was not because he thought they were obligations. Of course, Paul doesn't think that. Paul knows that he's not under the Mosaic law. So he says to the Jews, and then he says to those under the law, which is simply another way of referring to Jews. And he may have included that reference. You say, well, why would he say to the Jews and those under the law? He may have included that reference because the specific issue was especially related, to Jewish legal requirements, not simply to matters of national origin. So he gets more specific by hinting those under the law. We're talking about these dietary restrictions and their application of these food laws. And that parenthetical comment that he's not under the law. Right? He says, I'm not under the law. It's to clarify that his own conduct in doing this is a matter of freedom. It's not a matter of obligation. He says, look, I know that I'm not obligated by God to abstain from this meat. I know that. But I'm going to do it as an accommodation to the Jews that I'm with at the time. So those without the law, that refers to Gentiles, including, of course, the majority of Corinthian Christians, and the majority of those who stood against him, who are whatever these voices are in Corinth that are saying, hey, Paul really is not the guy to be telling us this stuff. You see, so he addresses them, and as he notes in chapter 10, verse 27, when he was with them, he ate whatever was put before him without raising questions of conscience. He didn't sit there and say, well, I got to know, where's this from? What's the root of this? Has this been here or this? We just ate it. You see, so when he was with them, that's how he did it. And the fact he ate with them but abstained from eating when he was with the Jews, it made them think, or at least they were able to use that to suggest that Paul lacked principle. A principled person wouldn't do that. He'd take the heat from telling the Jews, no, that's fine to do that. You see, and that's what they were saying. Now, the parenthetical comment that he's not without God's law, but that he's under the law of Christ, is to clarify that he's not lawless in the sense of behaving in a godless way. The fact he's not under the Mosaic law, which was tied to and wed to the Mosaic covenant, that he's not under that law doesn't mean that he's godless. You see, he's not under the Jewish law, but he's under the ethical imperatives of the Christian faith. Right? He lives as a Christian. He's under the ethical imperatives of the Christian faith, the ethics of the new age, of the new covenant, of the new order, you see, which in certain specifics overlaps the Mosaic law. But it's different from the Mosaic law. Right? So he's saying, look, it's not that I'm lawless, you see. I'm under the law of Christ. So he wants to make that clear. And the weak are probably the socially weak. You see, those without much social power or influence, and there were many such people there in Corinth, as you see in chapter 1, verse 26 through 31. And that's the group, that's into which most of the Corinthian Christians were in that group. And so Paul, he lowered himself by, quote, stooping to manual labor in a society and culture that had strata here and had status, and say, so that the manual laborer, that was different from the intellectual. That was different from the teacher. Well, Paul lowered himself to do these things, stooping to manual labor and doing without much. Right? He did without much, so his outreach to such people wouldn't be hindered. Why are you doing that, Paul? I do everything to bring down barriers to my being able to share the truth of God with people. And that's how Paul lives. And so then they take what is really a noble, Christ-like quality, and they're trying to use it against him. But fortunately, Paul will have none of it. You see, Paul will have none of it. Now, the second part of verse 22 summarizes the argument. I have become all things to all men in order that by all means I might save some. And that's why he made the choices that he made with regard to non-essential things, why he seemed to go both ways on such matters as marketplace food. That's what was driving it. And the bottom line is that what some were interpreting as a strike against his genuineness was in reality, it was the fruit of his zeal for the gospel, which is a hallmark of apostolic authenticity. Right? That's what it was. It was the fruit of his zeal. I care about getting this message out, teaching people about Jesus. So that's a hallmark of what is an apostle about. There it is. And yet you see how things work, right? These good, noble things, people, they're using it. They're trying to use it against him. In verse 23, he says he acts this way, that he does all things for the sake of the gospel. He says literally, in order that I might be a fellow sharer or a fellow participant in it. Okay, in other words, he does this so he might be a fellow participant, I think, with the Lord in the cause of the gospel, that he might share Christ's cause as his own, rather than have it be just an assignment that he carries out. He says here, I do all things for the sake of the gospel in order that I may be a fellow sharer in it, that I may own this, that I may align my heart and soul and spirit and everything with the Lord Jesus and his interest in getting this message out to people. I want to share in that with him. I want to have that, and I think that's what he's talking about. I know the bell's going to go off. 32 seconds. Dare I? Should I? Nah. We're going to start 9:24 to 27. And here it's a transitional paragraph. Paul starts to turn. And so I'll be able to read it and then the bell will go off. So thanks for coming. Take the extra time.